like to say hello. Welcome, everyone, to the first meeting of 2023 for the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. I'm Glenda Bullock. I'm the program chair. I hope your day is going very well. And here in Southeast Michigan, we are enjoying some beautiful weather. So everyone here is in a pretty happy mood. And we're also very happy today because we have as our speaker, Eric Pallant. He's a professor, a serious amateur baker, and author of Sourdough Culture, the History of Bread Making from Ancient to Modern Bakers. And our online host for today's program is the Ann Arbor District Library. They provide promotional and tech support for us on Zoom, and we are always so grateful for their help. You can find recordings of many of our culinary historians programs on the library's YouTube channel, AADL TV. And I know we're all pretty familiar with Zoom by now, but if you don't want your face to show during the recording, please turn off your video. Your microphone will be muted during the talk, but Eric will take questions at the end as time allows. And you can post your questions and comment in the chat and then select Ann Arbor District Library as the recipient. Or Eric Pallant. One more tip: on the top right of your screen, there's a button that says view, and you will want to click speaker view or side-by-side view instead of gallery view for your best viewing experience. And we may have some newcomers who are watching today. So we always want to provide a little program about the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. We are an informal group of people who are interested in the history and culture of food and cooking. Our group was founded in 1983. It makes us 40 years old, and new members are always welcome. We have monthly talks between September and May. And since the pandemic, most of our meetings have been on Zoom, although we are starting to add back in some in-person talks as well. But you'll always be able to watch the programs thanks to the library on YouTube or on the library's website. In case you can't come in person. We have twice yearly potluck meals, usually in July and December. They're delicious and fun. And our December meal featured meal featured food from the Bonnie British Isles. It was a really nice event. So if you're not a member of CHAA, we would love to have you join. Our membership is $25 a year for an individual or family, and it includes a subscription to our quarterly magazine, Repast, which is edited by Randy Schwartz. If you'd like to join our group, you can find membership information on our website. That's culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org, and click on membership. You can also find us on Facebook. Just search for Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor and like our page to get our news in your timeline. So now it's time to introduce our speaker. Eric Pallant is the author of Sourdough Culture, The History of Bread Making from Ancient to Modern Bakers. It was published in 2021. He is a serious amateur baker, a two-time Fulbright scholar, an award-winning professor, and the Christine Scott Nelson Endowed Professor of Environmental Science and Sustainability at Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania. He is well known for his skill in weaving research narratives into compelling stories for NPR, CNN, Foreign Policy, the Gresham Lecture Series in London, the Bread Symposia, podcasts, and articles for magazines such as Sierra and Science. We are very delighted to have him with us today. Welcome, Professor Pallant. And just to get things started, I was hoping you could tell us how you got started in your interest in sourdough culture.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for all of you who are at least simulcasting the NFL playoffs and watching those at the same time. I appreciate your being here. And so I've got two things I need to try and accomplish here in 45 minutes. One is to talk about how one gets a book out of this thing, which is just glop. Right? It's just a mess of flour and water, but a living ecosystem of bacteria and yeast that have fallen into this particular jar, and how you go from that to a book, a book about glop. And I'm also going to try and cover 6,000 or maybe closer to 10,000 years of history in 45 minutes. So put on your seatbelts. But before I get to that, how did I get into this? And as I was saying to Glenda, I think a big part of it is I don't have Zingerman's in my backyard. And in fact, I don't have any bakery in Meadville, Pennsylvania. And there was no way to get decent bread. And I love decent bread. And so I was at a picnic in my first year here in Meadville, Pennsylvania, and had the best bread I ever had. And somebody said, "This is sourdough, and do you want it?" And they gave it to me. And after working with this living ecosystem for 25 years, I looked at it one day and I thought, this is older than my children, who were late teenagers at this point, and thought, I don't have anything I own that's this old for the most part, right? My telephone, my washing machine, my dishwasher, my refrigerator, all of them have crunked out in that period of time. And yet I still have this living ecosystem. How old is it? And that is the investigation of the book. And what I can say for certain is that one of my 3 starters that I have going in my refrigerator right now is from the original one that got me going is from the gold rush of Cripple Creek, Colorado in 1893. So I have a starter that's 130 years old. And in fact, if you want a sample of it, you can write to me or go to my website and I'll tell you how to get that one, or this one that's 30 years old, or a Russian rye starter that I've got from a rye bread factory in the old Soviet Union from 1960. So it's about this sourdough culture also includes the culture of the place and the people where they were. And so what I want to do is I'm a professor, so I'm going to go through the PowerPoint and I will share that with you. I will try to cover how we got through 6,000 years of sourdough history to end up with 150 years of junk bread made by factories, and then what I think the future of bread might be and how it relates to all of us. So with that, let me see if the technology will do what I wanted to do. Got to move some things around. Looks good for most people. Okay, let me just. All right, so here we go. The rise and fall and rise again of bread, more or less 6,000 year history. Back, and just again, a brief introduction of me and who I am. I teach environmental science and sustainability here at Allegheny College in Northwest Pennsylvania, and I use bread as a way of drawing students into things that they might not have thought were academic subjects, but we'll get to that in short order. And while we're doing definitions, let's define bread. If I've defined me as a professor, we'll define bread as the way it really should be done, is only 4 ingredients. To make bread, you only need flour, water, salt, and salt's not totally necessary, but if you forget it, it's noticeable. It's just not great bread. And a leavening agent. And the leavening agent for 6,000 years has been sourdough starter. And so the first question I have is like, why bread? I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures of breads that I have made over in recent past. And I just want to get your reaction as you look at these breads. And why is it that a bread of almost any shape or size, and as I start to describe it, the warmth of it, you can smell it. Why is it? What is it about bread that makes your mouth water? Right? That was one of the first questions I had to ask about what is it essentially about bread? And I trust now I have your attention that we've shown some pictures of bread. And I guess let's go back to hunters and gatherers, to the ancient sort of pre-agricultural world where food meant survival. And before the invention of agriculture, you went out and men went out primarily, and they killed an ibex or a gazelle or a deer or something like this. And we know from all hunter-gatherer societies that when you killed a deer, you ate as much as you could. And then you paused for a little bit and you kept eating. Why? Because you weren't sure when the next kill was going to succeed. seed. And so the object was to pack in as many calories as you could while you could. And the net result was that you, if you were going to survive, you had learned to love that smell of barbecue. And I think to this day, it's innate in all of us. Even vegans and people who've just had a full meal find that the smell of barbecuing meat, whether they like it in principle or not, will make their mouths water. And that is a kind of survival instinct that you have to have. If you didn't think that freshly killed meat was good to eat, you weren't around to tell the story for your descendants, really, right? And the same is true with the smell of bread. And that's why those pictures of bread make all of us start to think, oh man, that just looks so good. And I think the same is true because it meant we were going to live another day. And so now let's move ahead to the transition from hunting and gathering to the first time somebody is figuring out that we can put a seed in the ground rather than going out into a random field and collecting a handful of seeds and pounding them in a mortar and pestle and hoping that we'll make a slurry out of it and a porridge or something like that. If we took particular seeds like these wheat seeds and put them in the ground, we could have food where we wanted it and when we wanted it. And so unlike just barbecue, the smell of cooking bread also meant we were going to survive. And so it meant something for the whole community if we had enough wheat to grow that the whole community was going to live another day. Okay, so wheat gets invented or domesticated. It's not invented, it's a wild plant before 10,000 years ago. But 10,000 years ago, the last ice ages end. Ice recedes up into the mountains, the fertile plains here of the Fertile Crescent. This is essentially working our way in the lower left up from Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran, all the way down to the right, is where these grains were first domesticated. And 10,000 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age, this was happening all over the world with other kinds of native grains. So in East Asia, what was the native grain that early domesticators were figuring out? It was rice. In North America, what was the grain? Corn or maize. And in South America, it was potatoes, right? So all of those, we can trace their ancestry back to about 10,000 years. First breads were, again, just mashed grains that were put into a slurry and then just laid on the side of a hot rock or on this kind of an oven like this, and they were essentially flat breads. And so we don't have leavened breads yet. Those don't come until about 6,000 years ago, when we have this domestication of wild yeast and wild bacteria, though, of course, nobody knows that's what's going on. It's simply a magical glop, the one I just showed you at the beginning, a wet mass of flour that has yeast and bacteria that are all around us now. Wherever you're sitting, you're surrounded by yeast and bacteria, some of which will thrive on flour if they're given flour. And when they do, they make these little bubbles, and those little bubbles, particularly in a field of wheat flour, will cause the wheat flour to rise. And so here's the recipe. If you mix these ingredients together pretty much in any quantity, it's not hard to figure out what makes the best bread. Put it into an oven, you will get something that's really exceptional. It's delicious. It's different from what went into the oven, which was wet dough. What comes out is something that makes our mouths water. It means we're going to survive. We're going to live. We're not just going to live. We're going to thrive. We're going to have a great day because this is really delicious. And that discovery 6,000 years ago of domesticated wheat, a few other grains, learning how to manage this dough that you could save some of because it was alive, but you didn't know that it was alive, but it was alive, and put it into tomorrow's dough, was the only way to make bread, and bread being the basic, as I'm going to show you, the basic method of survival for millennia now, until the 1700s, was the only way to make bread. And so the question I'm going to now engage in is, how did we get from 6,000 years of sourdough to this bread that comes in a bag that looks like a circus flag, right, with all these pretty colors on it? But I'll show you the list of ingredients later, and you'll see it's not any longer just 4 ingredients. So the first time we have a pretty confirmed record that sourdough breads were being made are the ancient Egyptians. So here is the Egyptian equivalent of Instagram, which is the hieroglyphics on the walls of the tombs. And we have many, many indications that breads were being made, that wheat was being harvested, that the wheat was being ground and milled into flour. And the archaeologists have gone so far as, again, on the right here are the images of all the steps it takes in planting, harvesting, tilling, milling wheat into flour. We could calculate how many loaves of bread were made, and then back calculate how many people could have been supported by that many loaves of bread to build the pyramids. And so there are calculations that are based, it's a wonderful archaeological dig in Giza. And anybody who's ever tried to bake bread may have had this experience, but they certainly had this experience in ancient Egypt, that the breads they made in clay cylinders. And if you bake bread in a clay cylinder, sometimes it sticks to the inside of the cylinder. And I can imagine how frustrating that is, because I've had it happen to me where it sticks to the pan. And what the ancient Egyptians did is they had no shortage of clay to make the clay cylinders. And so they got to all of their bread simply by smashing the clay cylinder and taking the bread out and serving that bread. And what they've calculated is there are 500,000 broken clay cylinders at the excavation site in Giza, from which they can then back calculate that fed 10,000 workers, and that they were drinking, and we know this from even better archaeological evidence, and I can talk about that later if you want, that they were drinking beer. And it turns out that the species of yeast that creates the bubbles inside of a bread that makes the bread rise is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is exactly the same species of yeast that will grow in beer. And so we always think of beer as just being liquid bread, and bread being just beer that has a firmer take to it. So we know that you can keep a lot of people alive on beer and bread and a little bit of meat. All right, after the 3,000 or 4,000 year run of the Egyptians, the next sort of major empire as wheat and sourdough move west into Western Europe are the Romans. And we also have the Romans being incredible note takers and history keepers. We know that they also used an incredible amount of bread to essentially pacify the masses. So every free person in ancient Rome received 75 pounds of grain or flour or bread. And here you see in the picture on the right, bread being given out to the free men of Rome. And at the same time, there were these, the hippodromes and the gladiator things and so forth. The idea being, as Juvenal, a philosopher of the period, said, more or less as an insult with respect to the Roman leaders, he said, give them bread and circuses and they will never revolt. And what he was saying is, so long as you take that portion of the population and that's most likely to be difficult. And so that's what young men in their teenage years, and give them enough bread and some kind of entertainment, let's call it NFL football and pizza. In the modern day, they will not have the desire to sort of overthrow the government. And for the most part, that was very much the case during not just the Roman Empire, but as we'll see, I'll just pull out one example of many. If bread gets to be hard to come by, it's very expensive, you do tend to see revolutions. All right, so here's one more reason we know that Rome in some ways built their empire around wheat. This yellow in the map is a map of essentially the Roman Empire. It also overlaps almost perfectly with where wheat will grow best. So in the green areas of Africa, of course, you'll see that's the Sahara, it's too dry to grow wheat. But in the green areas to the north in Europe, it's too cold and too wet. And so it's a little too, wheat is a fairly finicky crop, but it's also the only grain with a sufficient quantity of gluten, which is what holds the wheat flour together, so it will rise, to make a loaf of bread. So you can make bread out of any other grain. You can make a bread out of ground cornmeal, but cornmeal has no gluten. And after you have worked that cornmeal and infected it with a sourdough starter, it will be fermented, but you're only going to have a tortilla at the end. It'll still be a very flat bread. If you take lentil flour, you're going to end up with a dosa. Again, a very flat bread. If you take rye flour, which has a little bit of gluten in it, and rye is what's growing in those green areas in the north of Europe, you will get a very dense bread. It doesn't rise like a wheat bread. A real 100% rye bread is a doorstop. It's a very hearty bread. It'll keep you alive for a long time. So what I want you to look at is Britain, and that line between the yellow and the green in Britain. And that line is exactly where Hadrian's Wall has been assembled. Hadrian's Wall was put up by the Romans, and most historians will say that it was put up to keep the Scots. The Scots were a vicious fighting force to the north or the left of the wall here of Hadrian's Wall. But it's also almost precisely the boundary from which wheat will no longer grow to the north. To the north of this wall, you can't grow wheat in Great Britain because it's too cold and too wet and too damp, and you have to pick a crop that has a better sense of humor than wheat. And so you go with oats. And if you go to Scotland, what do you get? You get oatmeal and oat cakes and oat scones, right? Of course, you can go to Warburton's and get regular bread now, but in those days, oats were the things that grew best in that colder, wetter climate. And by all accounts, the Romans didn't like oats. And so I always think of Hadrian's Wall, this is not real history, but as like, let's keep the oats out as well as the Scots. Scandinavia, again, it's colder and wetter in Denmark and Germany, in Norway, and those are rye countries. So if you're going to get the native breads of those countries, you're going to get a dense bread. It will be a sourdough bread. It will have some fermentation and some rise to it, but it is not going to be a light Italian bread or a French baguette. All right, here's the one case where bread and circuses doesn't work. So let's go to the eastern side of the far eastern edge of the Roman Empire, right? And so what we have here is the first essentially miracle performed by Jesus. It's the only one that is recounted in all four of the Gospels. And it's the story of the loaves and the fishes, in which there are 5,000 people waiting for food, and there's not enough bread to go around. And Jesus says, don't worry, I have enough to go around, which would have made sense to a group of people who understood that sourdough can be expanded indefinitely, right? That a sourdough starter can be fed and refed and grown and grown and grown and can feed essentially an infinite number of people. What does Jesus say at the Last Supper? He says, my body is bread, my blood is wine, both products of fermentation, both products that are transformed by what was at that point unknown, something religious, something spiritual, something changed in a dough if it was given this sort of godly-like thing that went into the dough. And here's one of my favorite things is think of it this way: is wheat is alive in the field. When wheat is harvested, it's killed. When it is reinfected with a sourdough starter, it is brought back to life. It's put in the oven where it dies to become the staff of life for humans. And I think this idea that my body is bread wouldn't have been lost on anyone at the time who understood that bread and circuses wasn't the secret to longevity, but a sourdough starter like mine from 1893 could stay alive forever and keep me fulfilled in a way that almost nothing else can. Right? I am the bread of life, right? I will never go hungry. I will feed you both spiritually and physically for as long as it takes. And again, everybody would have had a sourdough starter at home at the time. And it was not lost on the followers. Here's a sourdough starter here, but the Eastern Orthodox Church. So again, the Eucharist, which is given out at Catholic masses, is the body of Christ, and we're going to share this bread. But the Eucharist, the Eastern Orthodox or Nestorian Church, insists, based on their scripture, reading of scripture, that their Eucharistic bread actually comes from the body and blood of Christ. They can trace it back to the tears of Christ on the cross and the piercing and the saving of the blood, and using that to infect the starters that then went out with the church around Assyria, Armenia, farther east, almost into China, and so forth. So in some ways it's literal, and it's not just Christianity, right? So here is bread in Islam. The best of all deeds is that you bring happiness to your Muslim brother by feeding him bread. And anyone who's been to a Shabbat dinner, right, knows that that Shabbat dinner is built around two chalot that carry a kind of spiritual meaning that becomes part of our bodies. All right, certainly less spiritually oriented, but very much a question of life. Let's move ahead. The fall of the Roman Empire, we're about 400 CE. We're going to move ahead to now from 400 to 1400, the next 1,000 years, what we call the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. Again, it's the staple. Without enough bread, you're going to have famine, which happens on a regular basis in Europe. And the key to making enough bread was portrayed this way as sort of happy peasants out farming wheat for, a happy Thanksgiving repast, when in fact, in real life, it was really tough work. And not always were there more calories harvested than were consumed in the process of doing the harvesting. And so starvation and hunger were tough, especially because if you were a serf, you were expected to give a significant amount of your takings to either the church or the lord of the manor. So it was a very, very difficult time, 1,000 years of sort of touch and go. Moreover, the breads that were made in a communal oven. No serf had enough money, enough land, enough time to build an oven, to cut the wood, to stoke the oven. And so you went, first of all, to the miller, who was a monopolistic miller. He worked for the lord of the manor. All of his profits went to the guy at the top of the pyramid. Likewise, the communal oven operator or the baker also worked for the lord of the manor. And so you tended to hate both of those guys because they controlled life and death. If you had hungry children at home and couldn't afford more bread or couldn't afford more flour, you blamed it on these guys because they worked not for you, but for the person who was running and owned all of the land. By the 1700s, we do have a start to urbanization. We have a start to a guild of bakers, but the price of bread doesn't always stay within reach of poor people who need access to bread. And the French Revolution starts in many ways because the price of bread gets to be too expensive. And that business of if you don't give the people bread in circuses, they will revolt was certainly true in the French Revolution. It was true in the Russian Revolution. It was true in the Arab Spring. If you go to Wikipedia and look up food revolts, you'll see more than 20 bread riots or food revolts just since the year 2000. So it holds true today that you need to keep the price of food within range of poor people, or hungry people will do anything to overthrow a government that they feel is in their way. Marie Antoinette probably left behind the most famous quote of any revolution, right? If the people have no bread, let them eat cake. She actually said, let them eat brioche, which in many ways is very, very similar to cake. Only thing is she never really said it. It was attributed to her 50 years after the revolution as a way of justifying the revolution. She didn't say it. She would never have said it. It's still a quote that we all know. Nonetheless, this is a bread guillotine is what it's called. It would the same fate here for Marie Antoinette and King Louis XIV, both of whom lost their heads during the revolution. And we're now into the 1600s, so we're getting closer to the present day when the first microscope is invented. So this is the same time as Galileo is looking at the heavens and discovering that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but that there's all kinds of stuff up there. Somebody, Antoine von Leeuwenhoek, turns that around and starts to look at microscopic things and discovers there's a whole world smaller than we could see. And so for the first time ever, there's a look that humans and the church and everything else that had been defined for 1,000 years might not be what we thought it was. And so von Leeuwenhoek took everything, literally everything he could find and put it under his microscope and enlarged it. And here you can see just some of his pictures of white blood cells and red blood cells. And he's the first one to look at yeast cells and bacteria cells and sperm cells. And I'll let you figure out how he got each one of those onto a microscopic slide. But he didn't know what any of these things were. He didn't know that a yeast cell or a blood cell, right? Until this time, blood was just a red substance that came out when you cut something, right? It wasn't made up of individual parts. Nobody knew if a yeast was alive, was it an animal, a vegetable, a molecule, and he calls them animalcules in 1600. And it's going to take 200 years of sort of experimentation done by dozens of scientists in France, in Germany, in England, before Louis Pasteur can conclude in the late 1800s that yeast are living things, that they make carbon dioxide, and they do it when they're fermenting flour or grain, and in the process of releasing the carbon dioxide. But we're now into the late 1800s before we have, or the middle 1800s, before we know what actually caused bread to rise or beer to carbonate. And we're just about at the same time where Great Britain is going to ruin what I consider to be a ruin, good bread, right? And so this is your classic afternoon tea sandwich with the edges cut off and all that. But here's why. The Industrial Revolution essentially changes everything. The idea that if textiles can be made by a machine, why can't food be made by a machine? And so on the left here, we have a spinning jenny that's used to make textiles. And on the right, the idea of a continuous oven. No longer do we have to fire up an oven, wait 6 hours for it to heat, put in our loaves of bread, take out the loaves of bread, reload the wood, reheat the oven, restock the bread and all that. A continuous oven could look like a continuous textile manufacturing. At the same time, now that we know from Louis Pasteur what yeast is, we can grow yeast, the special kinds of yeast that are the fastest yeast, the strongest yeast, the most powerful yeast, and exclude the bacteria that are in a sourdough starter that makes the bread sour. It has other benefits, but let's just make bread rise as quickly as possible, because the faster bread rises and the faster we can cook it, the more profit we can make. This is the Industrial Revolution at its best. And so, as Glenda indicated, I was in England looking at the origins of the Industrial Revolution in the Manchester area to see how industrialization sort of ends a 6,000-year run of one recipe. It all but finishes sourdough culture by the year 1900. The death blow really is going to come in 1961, when, again, the Brits invent something called the Chorleywood bread process, named after the town, the village of Chorleywood, where it was invented. But it was basically like a Model T, right? It was like Henry Ford's operation, where you could generate bread in very large quantities on a continuous operation from the beginning to the end, mechanize the whole thing, and it would be as efficient as any industrial factory line, and it would come off the factory line, in my opinion, tasting like any Model T tastes to this day. And here we are now, sort of the epitome of bread manufacturing, the American bread factory. There's one not far from me here that turns out 150,000 breads a day in a factory, not like this, very similar to this. And the way they do it here is a modern mixing machine. Just to give you a sense, that's like a size of a small rail car. The mixing thing is in the middle. That's the thing that twists the dough. On the outside is a cooling, essentially refrigerant, because the friction of that thing moving, rotating at something like 3,000 RPMs will heat a bread dough about 70 degrees Fahrenheit if it's not cooled. That's how powerful it is. And that's why we're going to get this as a kind of recipe. This is what goes into Wonder Bread right now, is Americans have changed from that 4-ingredient bread that was available at, for 6,000 years, to this. We had to change the dough to be able to withstand the machinery. The machinery is so powerful that dough would rip apart if we didn't put in dough strengtheners and dough enhancers and dough stretchers and dough conditioners and put in additional sugars like high fructose corn syrup to feed the yeast, to make the yeast go so fast that will inflate a bread in a matter of 20 or 30 minutes. So we can get the whole process done in 2.5 hours. It's about profit rather than taste. And sourdough would have, I think, all but disappeared if it hadn't been, well, essentially for hippies in the 1960s and 1970s who rediscovered bread as it used to be made. And now I'm just, again, you have to read the book if you really want the details, but here's one of the saviors of bread in the last decade or two, where we've seen a real renaissance of sourdough bread making. Chad Robertson in San Francisco, who makes 250 loaves a day by hand. And I went out there once, reputed to be like one of the best breads you'd ever have. And I went over there and tried one of his breads made from ancient grains that sort of predated wheat. And I stood online and I was like, oh my God, this is the most amazing bread I've ever had in my life. It really, the guy deserves all the credit he can get. And now most of us, me excluded, because I still live in Meadville, Pennsylvania, but the rest of you live within striking distance of an artisanal bakery as well as an artisanal brewery and more coffee shops than I know, right? But that there's a kind of return to, food made from food. Food made the way it could be made and the way it should be made. And so it turns out there are other kinds of wheat than the ones that are used most commonly for making industrial bread. And there are other kinds of grains from which we can make really fabulous, delicious breads. And I guess I wanted to ask one more question, which is like most people who I think were listening here will remember that when we first went to lockdown, that everybody started making sourdough bread. And the question is like, why sourdough bread, right? Yeah, ostensibly there was a shortage of yeast and that was going to be something terrible, but none of us were making yeasted breads before the pandemic. And so what was it about sourdough bread that everybody started doing it, like sort of all around the world? And I think it has to do with, it was a reminder of something inside of us, like that salivation reflex that said, you know, there's something out there trying to kill us, but if we make bread and we make good bread the old-fashioned way, we'll survive the way our ancestors survived. This is not conscious, but we're going to live another day. Our community is going to live another day. And so I want my community to know how important they are to me. So even though I can't see them, I'm going to make a loaf of bread and run over to my neighbor and put it on their doorstep and ring the doorbell and run away. And together we'll say, our community, this matters. We're going to live, even though some other microscopic thing is trying to kill us all. So here's where I think the future needs to go. And the thing I'm starting to think more about is that, okay, Chad Robertson's bread or bread at Zingerman's is an amazing thing, but not everybody can afford that, right? And there are still people who have to go to the dollar store and can buy 50-cent Wonder Bread. And that's not fair. That's not just. And so most states have members of this group. I belong to Bakers Against Racism. And I guess I just want to finish up with a reminder that real bread is about community. The best recipes, in my opinion, are for breads that you eat with someone else. It's about a kind of fulfillment that's not just making me full in the stomach, but full in my body and in my spirit. Bread is meant to be shared. No matter how good it is, it tastes better if you're eating it with somebody else. And I guess I want to finish with bread really is about love. And those of you who are, Go Blue fans, this is the defensive line for the Allegheny College football team in their freshman year and explains why our record is what it is on the football field. They're better bakers than they are defenders. But look at the pride it comes when they learned how to make bread. All right. That's what I have. As I had hoped, I've got 15 minutes to answer questions. I think you can put them in the chat, and I will answer them as they come in. One comment is we made bread during the pandemic because we had time, finally. I agree completely. But it's also like I had time to do push-ups or take up knitting. And we didn't do that in the same way that that we took up bread making. And what I like about my hypothesis is it's completely untestable and nobody can prove me wrong or right. My website, I think, is just ericpallant.com. But Google me, just Google Eric Pallant, you'll find me. Or send me an email. Okay. What is my opinion of no-knead bread? It's great. No-knead bread is great. The new technique, like who thinks, like after 6,000 years, who would come up with new techniques for bread? Stretch and fold is the way to go now. And the great recipes, I don't need anymore. I also don't go to no knead, but I stretch and fold every 30 or 40 minutes. And that works well. They're all great. Sprouted bread is popular now. Why? There's some limited evidence that sprouted bread has more nutrition, that the act of sprouting breaks down some of the compounds that are in the seed before you mill it. And so there are people doing it that way. There are all kinds of claims about the health benefits of sourdough. I'm not going to go there because they're really hard to prove one way or the other. My feeling, I'm just really cutting to the quick, eat sourdough bread because it tastes good. That's the best reason. The Last Supper, says Ellen, was a Passover Seder. Wouldn't the bread been unleavened, matzah, and that sourdough? That's a great question. I really went down a rabbit hole too about whether the Last Supper was a Seder or not. And there's all kinds of sort of evidence, both pro and con, about what day it took place. Is it the day before Passover? Is it the Great Seder or something like that? In the end, I suppose what matters here is the story that Christians tell themselves about the validity of Christ's body being bread, and his blood being wine. And trust me, I'm not going to arbitrate on that one. Oh, great question. To what extent do levains take on the characteristics of the local environment? So this is a great question. Is this starter, which is my Meadville starter or my Cripple Creek, Colorado starter or my Russian rye starter, do they carry with them the essence, the flavors, the terroir across decades and centuries and thousands of miles? And I spent a considerable amount of time in the book trying to figure that out. Does it matter, like wine, if a starter is 100 years old or if it's 20 years old or 5 years old? Does it matter if it came from France or if it came from the top of the Rocky Mountains? And here's why nobody knows. It is to do the experiment, I would have to do a full DNA analysis, and I have done the DNA analysis on this and on one of my other starters, to figure out exactly what species of yeast and bacteria in here. There are probably about a dozen yeast species and a dozen bacterial species. Then I would have to do the experiment of testing this again in a week to see if they're the same, and in a year to see if they're the same. Then I have to give some of you in Ann Arbor same starter and see if you keep it the same over a course of a day and a week and a year. And then you're going to give it to somebody in California who's going to do it. And the question is, nobody can afford to do that much DNA analysis. And so we don't know if starters for sure keep their species the same for decades and across continents. My feeling is they do, but it's not totally scientific. What I do know is that my starter from Cripple Creek, Colorado, comes with a story of the gold rush of Colorado that can only come with that starter. And so the story of the starter is in some ways inviolate. And I appreciate that. Most people who are infected by sourdough starters come to love their starters like they love their other pets. But it's not clear that it's any better than when you started your own. Somebody asked if they could purchase some of my ancient starter. Absolutely. Again, go to my website. You'll find it an easy way to do it. I will send you a dried sample of the starter, which you can reconstitute when you have the time, right? It's in suspended animation in dried form. It will stay that way until summer vacation. It'll stay a year from now, through the mail, whatever. So great. I'm amazed, says Jessica, that people would make a windmill to grind grain to make flour rather than just eating gruel. And all I can say to that is that the archaeological evidence is that from the time of domestication is about 8 to 10,000 years ago. The time of bread making is about 4 to 6,000 years ago, which meant for 4,000 years, all they could eat was gruel. And I think after 4,000 years of eating nothing but gruel, you would make a windmill too, right? There's nothing like a loaf of bread after 4,000 years of gruel. So is the bacteria in all sourdough the same? And the answer is absolutely not. And we're now talking about more than 100 different species of bacteria, more than 100 different species of yeast. Now, there are some that are much more common than others. My favorite story about that is the most, where does the most famous sourdough bread in America get made? San Francisco, right? And so for decades, San Francisco insisted you could only have San Francisco sourdough bread in the city of San Francisco because our climate is not like anybody else's. Our climate is, we have the fog, we have the rain, we have a warm, dry winter, blah, 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 only in this place. And they looked in their sourdough in the 1970s. This is before DNA analysis was easy to do. You had to plate out a sample of starter on an agar plate, and they discovered, yeah, there were some species there that had never been seen anyplace else. They named them San Franciscensis. I think it was Lactobacillus bacteria San Franciscensis. It's the one that gave it its special flavor. And for the next 25 years, that was proof that you could only get sourdough bread like San Francisco's in their city until somebody looked for it someplace else. And then it turns out that that bacteria is found all over the world, right? It's found in Kazakhstan, it's found in Japan, it's found in South America, blah, 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 okay? And so the question of which bacteria and yeast survive is a little bit different in everybody's house. So your starter is a little different than my starter. It's a little different than somebody else's, and I think that's wonderful. Sourdough needs a lot of maintenance, discarding a lot of flour. Was that also the case in ancient times? It's not even the case now. If you're finding one of those things online that says discard and discard and discard, I'm trying to think of an alternative word for bullshit, but it is bullshit. It's not something you really have to do. So I can talk to you that. One of my favorite bread recipes, right? This is what I love about bread. Is flour, sugar, beer. Why? Same yeast from the beer just went in, and it's Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It went in and it's making your bread rise. So the Egyptians did that. The Middle Ages, they did that. Definitely the British did that during the sort of early years of the Industrial Revolution. They kept beer foam, used that as their source of yeast, and used that to raise bread. I've done it. It makes bread taste like beer. If the best sourdough rye bread in Pennsylvania, somebody's asking me, besides making it yourself, I mean, I can send you a sourdough starter from the Soviet Union from 1960 with a story about its origin. It's just fascinating. But the best rye bread in Pennsylvania, even if I knew, I couldn't tell you because we wouldn't agree, right? So I'm going to let you go on a journey that you'll enjoy. It's like how could you go wrong? Just keep looking. Does the yeast change while the colony continues? That's a big part of the book. It's a big part of my investigation. The answer is maybe. In some cases, they seem very, very stable. In other cases, they seem like they change. And again, nobody's done the study. I don't think anybody can do this study. If the fermenting bacteria that's fundamental for sourdough breads is universal, why are some homemade sourdoughs sour while others are not noticeably sour? So the question of how sour is a sourdough bread, it turns out it's not just the bacteria in the yeast, but what temperature is my bread rising? How long has it been since the last time I used my sourdough starter? What kind of flour am I using? How long am I going to let my bread rise? Right? There are a lot of variables, and this is where the difference is. Like anybody can make sourdough bread. It's not very hard, but making good sourdough bread, great sourdough bread, takes practice. It's like playing the violin or learning to swim. I could throw you in the water. I could give you a violin and a bow and you would make a noise, but to be good at it, you have to practice. Oh, somebody's a graduate student, or was. Since the environment affects what grows, can you end up with inedible toxic mess? My house is 104 years old. Some wood structures, some of my batches have been nice and some are revolting. And that is the case. There are some starters that do come out disgusting. Throw those away, don't eat those, and start again. You know, that's basically my rule of thumb. The environment does select, and so you do need to be reasonably clean when you get started, and pick pretty good conditions. But in the end, here's how it was invented the first time 6,000 years ago. If you put flour and water out and wait 3 days, it'll start to bubble. It'll start to grow. And then if you just keep feeding it and giving it more bread and water and more flour and water, it'll keep growing. Can sourdough bread be whole wheat or rye bread? Absolutely. It can be anything. How do I store the starters? I store mine in the refrigerator, because how do you keep bacteria and yeast from growing on things is keep them cold, right? Or dry. This is about food preservation. And so the trick here is they're not very complicated, but I keep it in the refrigerator, and the day before I want to bake, I pull it out of the refrigerator and I feed it, and I wake up my bacteria and yeast. Say, pap, 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 pap. Time to get going. It's time to make bread. And making sourdough bread, somebody said, is essentially 15 minutes of work spread over 2 days. So you just have to be around. You don't have to be super precise about it. You certainly can be if you want reliable results that come out the same way all the time. But if you want really reliable results, comes out the same way all the time, use yeast, use commercial yeast, which is the same as this. And this is much more like a pet. It has personality, it has moods. It's not always exactly the same, but I maintain that's the fun of it, the joy of it. And if you're one of those bakers that's more like a chemist, like you read the meniscus on your measuring cup and so forth, this may not be the way to get started. But even if you are, it will still come out great. Okay, I have 50 more messages here, so I don't know that I'll get to all of them, but I'll go through a bunch more. Did I ever create my own starter? Yes, I have. And again, it's not hard. If they could do it 4,000 years ago, you can do it. It really is just a question of flour and water. And I can send you a recipe for starting your own if you want. Anyway, around discarding a portion of the starter. I know, so the discard stuff is where all of these new cookbooks and recipes and so forth are coming forth, like how to use the discard. And basically, again, send me an email. I'll tell you, I don't ever have discard, really. You know, the amount of starter you use is just, think of it as it's an inoculant. You are infecting, right? All the bacteria and yeast, they have all this much flour and water, but that's not going to make very much bread. So I'm going to double it and double it and double it. And so long as there's more to eat, they'll keep growing and they will infect the rest of the bread. And so why throw out any of it? Just put it in the bread. Oh, the starter names. If you have starter names, put them in here. I love starter names. They are hysterical. I've only named mine for where they come from, but some of them are just brilliant. All right. Has anyone recovered viable starter from ancient Egypt? Yes, there is somebody who insists that he has done so. Here's the difference between ancient Egyptian beer and ancient Egyptian bread. The bacteria and yeast on the urns that were used to make Egyptian beer are still alive, or they're dried, as And so therefore it can be brought back to life by taking a scraping of the beer scum that dried on the edge of the urn and feeding it, and those yeast will come back to life. The yeast, on the other hand, that was in the bread got cooked at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And so there's nothing alive there. Now, there is a guy who invented the X box of all things, Seamus, last name escapes me right now, who has had enough time and money to go find what he believes are yeast that were used for breads in ancient Egypt. He's cultivated them. What's most interesting is he says those yeasts grow best, those ancient Egyptian yeasts, on ancient grains, that they don't grow well on modern wheat. He had to go back and find emmer wheat and einkorn wheat that was grown in the Middle East 5,000 years ago to get it to really, really function and grow. So he thinks he's made ancient Egyptian bread. Can you make starter from a piece of baked bread? Think about it. The answer is no, because the baked bread has killed everything that went into the oven at 400 degrees. Bacteria and yeast don't survive 400 degrees. All right, how do you dry a starter? It's like making, you paint it. You basically paint it on a piece of parchment paper or something like that, and you set it out for 2 days or 3 days and let the moisture run out of it, and then you have a cracker. And crackers, generally speaking, last very, very long time. So I make crackers and then I put them in a plastic bag and seal them up and mail them off to. Oh, great question. Do you recommend we buy your starters to mix with mine, or should I keep it separate? Entirely up to you. It's yours. You'll be able to do with it whatever you want if you get one of my starters. But I would not go and make my own wine and then buy a fancy Chardonnay and put them in the same jar. Oh, this one, which came first, bread or beer? That argument has gone on longer than whether the Last Supper was a Passover Seder or not. Unanswerable question. Glenda, can you do me a favor? Because I want to do it and look up my website and you put it in there. I'm pretty sure it's ericpallant.com, but I don't ever look for myself. So
I will do that.
Thank you. Okay, good question. Is the commercial Saccharomyces cerevisiae do the same as wild yeast? So it is the same species. I was most disappointed when I got back the DNA analysis on my 1893 starter. I was quite convinced I had a very rare, unique starter that could only be found 14,000 feet above sea level in the Rockies. And it turned out it was the same yeast as everybody else. I mean, I had 10 other species in there, and what their interplay is hard to know. There is a difference, though, when you go to the store and buy packaged yeast, it is the same species, but it is a variety that is so selected to be the strongest. Here's how strong it is. How strong is commercial yeast? So when you put in a tablespoon of commercial yeast into making your own bread, what do you have to do with it in an hour from now to that dough? It becomes the only food in the world you have to punch, right? You have to punch down. It is so aggressively good at making carbon dioxide that you can't, right? So the difference being is that these guys here, they're comparatively wimpy in comparison, but the range of flavors is something that you can never get with a single simple yeasted bread. Yeah, sometimes you can get molds on top. If if it takes a long time, you can get molds that will grow in there. But again, there's a really interesting part of the book that talks about how sourdough starters defend themselves. And it's related to how sourdough bread doesn't mold. Sourdough bread might go a week, 2 weeks without molding because of the acidity put out by the bacteria and the other compounds that the bacteria put out. it's the ecology of what's going on in there is, to me, very interesting. And if you don't want to do it, you can be like an ancient baker and skip the ecology and just make bread. There are better YouTube videos out there than mine. It is ericpallant.com. Okay, that is my. Oh, I like that one. Our sourdough bread is named bread, one fewer vowel than bread. Did I self-publish my book? No, I did not. There was a real professional publisher and editor and all that sort of stuff. I think I have reached the end of most of my questions. Most people are starting to grow weary. One new message of the thank you notes. But Glenda, should we call it?
Yes, I am just starting up my video again, and I says I'm muted, but I don't think I am muted.
Oh,
so yeah, thank you so much. I think you have inspired a lot of people to run to the kitchen right now and get their sourdough started. And we really appreciate this. It's been great. Want to thank the Ann Arbor District Library. I want to remind folks that next month we have a talk by Dr. Kelly Fanto-Dietz, who's Director of Education and Visitor Engagement at Stratford Hall Plantation in Virginia, who's going to be discussing the role that enslaved cooks played in inventing American cuisine. Look for more information on our website in February, and that website, of course, is Culinary Historians Ann Arbor.org. Thank you again, Eric. And as we said, for folks who want to maintain contact with him, his website is ericpallant.com. So thank you, everyone. Thanks again. Thanks for watching, and have a good evening.
All right. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the time.
It was great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.